Hello YouTube, thank you for clicking on this video and shout out to Big Daddy Algorithm for pimping it out to you. My name is Megan and welcome to my channel. In honor of Pride Month, I'm going to do my very best to get more than 2 videos out this month because I talk about LGBTQ+ things on this channel quite a lot. And it's my first Pride being fully out, so as you can see from my attire, I am going all the way in. I also have a pretty stacked calendar this month in terms of Pride events, so I don't know how great I'll be at getting more videos up. I mean, it's past mid-month already, and this is basically my first one, but I'm going to do my very best. No promises, though. Okay, so let's get into it. If you've paid attention to the world for like 5 seconds, you'll know very well that homophobia and transphobia has been on the rise, not just here in North America, but all over the world. It's been going on for a while, but the homophobes and transphobes have been particularly vocal since Trump was elected in 2016. This is all part of a larger discussion about fascism and book burning and the rise of Christian nationalism, and I've touched on this in a number of my videos already. One of these days, I'll probably do a full video on the rise of the alt-right, but for now, since I'm focusing on LGBTQ+ topics, I'm going to keep this video strictly on the topic of homophobia and transphobia, specifically to highlight where it's coming from and what's behind it. Thankfully, since coming out, I haven't personally experienced a really terrible backlash, although there's been like things that have happened here and there, but I definitely have received some passively homophobic comments that got me wondering about where that kind of thinking comes from and why it even exists. So, as with all things I get curious about, I decided to do a bit of a deep dive, and this video is the fruit of my labor. This video will not be getting too deeply into anti-gay legislation, book burning in schools, or any of the other broadly social and institutional examples of homophobia and transphobia. There are plenty of video essays on YouTube about that already, and as I just mentioned, all you have to do is turn on the news for like 5 seconds to get an idea of what's going on. I also want to be careful not to be flippant about these broader institutionalized examples of homophobia and transphobia because they're very serious and very scary, and they very much need to be taken seriously by all of us in the community and our allies. However, in this video, I want to talk more specifically about the intersection of homophobia and misogyny and how the patriarchal contempt for all things feminine is a huge part of the hatred of queer and trans people that's out there. I wasn't able to find a whole lot of good information on this intersection of queer and femphobia, and a lot of the good sources I did find are already pretty outdated. I've included them all below in the description as I always do, but just be aware that there isn't a ton of good research out there on this topic. So if you know of any, as always, chime in, and as always, don't forget to like and subscribe and let me know what you want to know more about. On this channel, I do deep dives and video essays about all kinds of things from history to fashion to LGBTQIA+ issues, all through a feminist lens. So if that's your jam, I'd love for you to stick around. Okay, no more side quests, let's actually get into it. Homophobia and women. Just in case anyone watching this is not aware of the fact that we live in a patriarchal society, we live in a patriarchal society, I'm sorry, and patriarchy hates women. More specifically, patriarchy hates its need for women and our sexual, emotional, and reproductive labor. If that sounds extreme, that's because it is. The existence of incels is a perfect example of how angry men can get when they perceive that they're being denied access to women. In patriarchal societies, masculine expressions of gender are valued over feminine ones. This should not be news to anybody. Even traditionally feminine expressions like long hair and natural makeup, a submissive attitude, nurturing, etc., are valued only insofar as they serve male interests and support male dominance and cater to the male gaze. Sexism is a system that upholds patriarchy, and it keeps women subordinate to men through economics, violence, and homophobia. Heterosexism, or compulsory heterosexuality as we now call it, is a weapon of sexism because it creates a climate of homophobia by assuming that the default state for everyone is to be straight and cisgender. Authoritarians and fascists on the right focus on controlling women's bodies as well as everyone's sexuality and gender because any choice that someone makes that doesn't directly benefit the nuclear family, and therefore patriarchy by extension, is seen as actively damaging it. Women who are sapphic, especially those who don't date men at all, are perceived as women who can live and love and be happy without men and without any societal institutions to protect them. In her book, Homophobia, A Weapon of Sexism, author Suzanne Pharr points out that many heterosexual women see a woman who loves women as someone who stands in contradiction to the sacrifices they have made to conform to compulsory heterosexuality. A lesbian is perceived as a threat to the nuclear family, to male dominance and control, to the very heart of sexism. As I discussed in my video about heterosexual marriage and who actually benefits from it, a lot of the time straight women have to make a lot of compromises to be in relationships with men. For a time, it was looking like this was improving, but with the hard right that a lot of younger men are taking now after being radicalized online, unfortunately, it seems like this is going to continue to be the case. Straight women often have to do a lot of emotional labor and often also physical and sexual labor when they're in relationships with straight men, and the more they adhere to traditional gender roles and ways of relating, the more this is true. Queer and sapphic women directly challenge this setup simply by existing, and it can be perceived negatively by those who have had to conform to the system their whole lives in order to survive in it, or to gain some sort of secondhand sense of empowerment by their proximity to men. TERFs. In March of 2018, J.K. Rowling thumbsed up a transphobic tweet, the contents of which I will not repeat here because this is a safe space. After she was slammed for liking the tweet, her spokesperson quickly reassured all of us that the author had had a clumsy and middle-aged moment, and that this wasn't the first time she had accidentally liked something by holding her phone incorrectly. Since then, J.K. Rowling has unleashed a barrage of increasingly unhinged transphobic tweets to the point where even Elon Musk has told her to chill. And if Elon Musk is telling you that you've gone too far, I mean, that's like Satan asking you to turn up the AC because it's too hot in here. She's also spoken out against bills in the UK that would make it easier for people to access gender-affirming care, publicly supported researchers and actors who are openly transphobic, and published an essay defending her stance. Are the boomers okay? Like, are you okay? Are you all right? Do you need help? Do you need some help? Do you need us to send some therapists? Like, what do you guys need here? I know I've already placed a disclaimer at the beginning of this video, but I want to insert another trigger warning here specifically for transphobia. If that's a trigger for you, then please skip this part because I'm going to be speaking about TERFs and their beliefs, and I don't want to trigger anyone. We don't want any mental health crises up in here, like, please skip ahead if this is a trigger for you. Trans-exclusionary radical feminists, or TERFs, are a group of mostly middle-aged white women who alternate among several theories, which all claim that trans women are really men and therefore the oppressors. Their ideas are adjacent to alt-right Christian nationalist and grifter panic about groomers and all that bullshit, which I'll be getting more into later. Don't you worry, we'll be talking about groomer panic. But essentially, they believe that trans women present some sort of a threat to cis women. TERFs grew out of 1970s radical feminist circles when it started to become clear that there needed to be a term to separate the feminists who support trans women and those who didn't. Their ideology is outdated at best and ignorant and dangerous at worst because it's based off of very prejudiced and outdated ideas of what it means to be trans and or genderqueer in some way. TERFs are basically like the flat earth society of gender because they outright ignore and deny actual updated high-quality research and science. After Laverne Cox and Caitlyn Jenner came out, trans people, and trans women specifically, have had more visibility and therefore more backlash, especially in online spaces. TERFs treat trans women as predators and trans men as victims of the patriarchy, and it's a form of biological reductionism. According to TERFs, anyone born with a vagina is oppressed, and anyone born with a penis is automatically the oppressor without any consideration for or knowledge of the complexities of biological sex, for one thing, nor the social construction of gender, nor the self-definition of trans people. TERF ideology is rooted in fear. For sure there are grifters, but as I mentioned at the beginning of this video essay, I'm not really interested in picking apart public figures specifically. I want to talk about the everyday TERFs and TERF-adjacent women, the quiet homophobes, and all the busy, tired people who don't have the time, nor the education, nor the inclination to look more closely into these issues, and so therefore just consume the hysterical headlines and accept them as fact. Let's be clear, TERFs are not actually feminists. It's hard to wrap your head around how women who claim to be feminists could be so unapologetically horrible to other women, and for all my digging and research rabbit holes, I have yet to find a solid peer review study that points to some answers, and I suspect that's because, like all things gender and sex related, the answers are complex. Women in alt-right movements. Fear makes people vulnerable to the ideologies of TERFs and alt-right grifters, numbers, and living in a capitalist patriarchal society creates a lot of fear. I talked about this in depth in my video about trad wives, but essentially, when you're hyper aware of your own vulnerabilities, it's human nature to seek out things that seem to bring a sense of relief and security while lashing out at a perceived other onto which society projects that fear. It's fascism 101 right there. Create a handy scapegoat that people can blame for their fear and misfortune while positioning yourself as the savior so that people flock to you and then you could gain power. It's what Hitler did in the 1930s, and it's what modern fascists are now doing to queer and trans people. Authoritarian societies, along with high demand religions like evangelical Christianity, offer a handy set of rules that, as long as they're obeyed, offer a sense of structure, security, and predictability. These rules give the appearance of safety, but not actual safety itself, because actual safety would require equity, fairness, and inclusivity, and that requires a lot of hard work to be done first. It requires all of us to examine our own internalized homophobia, transphobia, and femmephobia, and it requires each and every one of us to take on the responsibility of educating ourselves, setting aside time and energy to actively engage with good research, and use that to question and examine what we've been taught. That's hard work, and most people can't do it because capitalism and straight culture and nuclear family life make us tired. Grifters take advantage of that. They scream about ridiculous things to fearmonger and get a rise out of people because manipulating people's emotions is a great way to stay in power. On the surface, traditional gender roles are alluring. They provide a sense of purpose, containment, and easy answers on which to fall back when the world gets really scary. It's easy to see why women, especially younger women who are facing a very uncertain future, are falling victim to alt-right grifters who offer them a false sense of security by promising they'll find ultimate fulfillment in traditional marriage, gender roles, and motherhood. The reality, though, is that proximity to power does not equal power itself, and by making themselves subservient to men and reliant on a man's love to survive, straight women are also making themselves even more vulnerable to violence and poverty. The perception of many women on the right is that if the societal definition of what a woman is expands to include trans women and gender non-conforming people, it will somehow take away from cis women and the sacrifices they've made in order to remain in close proximity to power. It calls into question their choices and challenges their worldview, especially in the case of conservative religious women who believe that a woman's highest calling is to make babies and serve her husband. If trans people and gender non-conforming folk and queer women exist, what does that say about the choices that conservative cis women have made? If equal rights are given to marginalized women, where will their place then be in the social and cultural hierarchy? The fear of all this is why we see women flocking to alt-right movements and why we see women actively voting against their own interests time and time and time again. Femphobia and hierarchical worldviews. In 2023, researchers Ashley Hoskin, Karen Blair, and Diane Holmberg published a paper suggesting that femphobia is at the root of a lot of homophobic and transphobic sentiments. Their research found a link between homophobia, homonegativity, and hierarchical worldviews like those professed by alt-right American Christian nationalists, and that femphobia was a huge predictor of homophobia and transphobia. According to the authors, femphobia refers to the societal regulation and denigration of femininity across all gender and sexual identities, including inanimate objects perceived as feminine. Femphobic attitudes construe masculinity as superior to femininity regardless of any individual's gender, sex, or sexual orientation. In patriarchal societies, femininity is seen as being acceptable only in very specific circumstances when enacted at just the right level and in just the right contexts by straight, cis, and able-bodied women. Anything else is seen as an abomination, and social discomfort with male femininity especially is well documented throughout history, which I'll get into a little bit more later. People who are raised in hierarchical societies and/or high-demand religions and never step outside of them may have strong, visceral, emotional, and morally outraged reactions to a perceived misplacement of femininity, such as that of effeminate gay men or trans women. They attach morality to gender roles, which by definition are another form of hierarchy. In patriarchal societies, anything feminine is seen as soft, weak, and lesser than, and subscribing to what Hoskin et al. Refer to as social dominance orientation is a huge predictor of homonegative and transphobic attitudes. Social dominance orientation refers to a worldview in which society is seen as fundamentally hierarchical. If one belongs to what they perceive as a dominant group, such as being white, cisgender, straight, able-bodied, and upper middle class, they will fight to hold on to their place in the hierarchy. That's why the straight men are so mad about diversity, equity, and inclusion, because they perceive equity as taking something away from them, and in a way it is. It's taking away their belief in a fundamentally hierarchical society, if not their actual place in it. In patriarchal societies, masculinity is perceived as being inherently superior to femininity, and therefore anything that's feminine or femme-presenting is perceived as being lower down on the social hierarchy. Patriarchy is a form of social dominance orientation, as is capitalism and colonialism and racism and the caste system and any other system that lifts up one group or class of people over and above the rest. In these systems, at worst, women and femme-presenting people are overtly oppressed and violence is enacted upon us, and at best, we're treated with a condescending and paternalistic attitude that takes away our agency and our sense of self-worth. This is why, for the longest time, lesbians were socially oppressed but not actually illegal. While on the surface that might seem like a good thing, it comes from a place of erasure, invalidation, and sexism. Homophobia and gay men. Probably the most obvious form that homophobia takes is against queer men, even though they by far get the most positive representation when compared to other queer identities. A 1998 study showed that men on average tend to be more homophobic than women, and the same study also showed a correlation between developmental sexual anxieties and homophobia. I mean, all you have to do is walk down that hallway at your local high school where all the jocks have their lockers, and you'll hear the word gay being used as a slur like 80 times before you reach the end of that hallway, guaranteed. It should come as a surprise to no one that men by far and away have the biggest issues with people being queer, especially other men. This is mainly because of a fear that queer men will act towards them the same way that they act towards women. Straight men who only see women as sex objects and not as actual people will assume that everyone feels that way about the gender they're attracted to, and therefore will fear queer men because they don't want to be objectified in the same way, i.e. massive projections are happening like all over the place. If a straight man is turned into an object of sexual desire by the gaze of a queer man, then he is being feminized, and that's what's at the heart of this fear. It's not the same kind of fear that women have of men, that they'll stalk us, overpower us, harm us, murder us, take advantage of us. It's a different kind of fear, the same kind that drives men to avoid being pussy whipped by a woman, the fear of being emasculated. In a culture that praises and values and uplifts masculinity and male expressions of virility and power, being emasculated and turned into a sexual object is the worst thing that could happen to a man because it calls his masculinity into question. It's completely stupid, but that's the underlying fear that drives a lot of homophobic attitudes in men, especially towards other men. It's why for a long time there were sodomy laws in most places, many of which were punishable by death, whereas no such laws tended to exist for the purpose of policing the sexualities of queer women, because queer women weren't a threat. They were dangerous in other ways because they resisted male domination and objectification, but they did not directly threaten a man's masculinity in the same way that a queer man potentially could. No one in history really cared if women were queer or not. In fact, there are many ways in which men could sexually benefit from queer women, as any bisexual woman frustrated at the number of straight couples who want to treat her as their unicorn sexual plaything will readily attest to. Sapphic sex is not real sex. In many places and times throughout history, sex between two men was illegal, but sex between two women wasn't. In Canada, the earliest known instance of a sodomy conviction was in 1648, which involved a military drummer who was stationed with the French garrison in Montreal. At the time, any sex act between two men was referred to as a crime of the worst kind, and he was found guilty and sentenced to death. A group of Jesuit priests intervened on his behalf, and his life was spared, but he was forced to take on the job of executioner to escape the gallows himself. In my video about how the Enlightenment ruined everything, I touched briefly on sodomy laws in France, which had existed since the Middle Ages. No such laws existed to criminalize lesbians and sapphic women, and in France before the Revolution, it was even considered to be healthy and normal for young women to have close, intimate friendships with other women. That's because sex between two women wasn't seen as being real sex because it didn't involve penetration. Short break to cue the laugh track for all the women who have sex with women who are watching this right now. Straight culture, emphasis on straight culture as a whole, not individual straight people, reduces sex to the penetration of a vagina by a penis, even though only about 18% of people with vaginas can actually have an orgasm from this activity alone. 86% of lesbians report usually or always having orgasms during sex, as opposed to 65% of straight women. And yet, sex between women has historically been viewed through a patronizing and paternalistic lens when it's not being outright objectified and subjected to the male gaze. In the UK in 1921, the government had started to realize that there were whole entire groups of queer people out there who weren't gay men, so MPs introduced a bill which was meant to punish women for gross acts of indecency between other women. The bill made it all the way to the House of Lords, where it was promptly struck down because of a belief that if they made lesbians illegal, then it would simply end up creating more lesbians because women were weak and feeble-minded and would just blindly follow along with what, understandably, seemed like a great idea. Sapphic women have been viewed through the lens of this kind of paternalistic sexism for ages. Queer sex between women also serves the male gaze and fuels male fantasies, whereas sex between two men is seen as horrific and violating, so therefore women who love women have tended to be more widely tolerated. While on the surface it seems like a good thing that laws against lesbianism never really seemed to get off the ground or go anywhere for very long, it's actually a symptom of a misogynistic attitude that views women as weak and inferior and objects for male consumption. It's the same kind of mentality that modern douche canoes like Jordan Peterson have when they talk about the wave of teenagers and preteens who were assigned female at birth now coming out as trans and or non-binary. They refer to it as a social contagion, which betrays a latent sexism that they've obviously never bothered to challenge within themselves. This internalized misogyny is the real social contagion, not being queer or trans or non-binary. It comes from centuries of patriarchy that's reproduced itself over and over again in each successive generation, and unless you actively do the work to unlearn it, it's going to color how you see things like being LGBTQIA+, or how you interact with women and people who belong to minority groups. Groomer panic. The idea of social contagion when it comes to queer and trans people is what underlies the current groomer panic against trans people specifically. There's this fear out there that being taught about queer and trans people will somehow turn kids gay or influence them to be trans or non-binary, and if you're not educated yourself about sex and gender, then it's easy to fall prey to this kind of fear-mongering. Groomer panic is by far the most common type of queer and transphobia that members of our community are likely to encounter, and it can show up in really covert ways, like being asked to not kiss your same-sex partner in front of a child because you might influence them or destroy their innocence, as if they're not going to be seeing straight people kissing on TV all the goddamn time. No one's afraid that their kids will be influenced to be straight, except for me if I were going to have kids, which is one of the many, many reasons I will not be doing that. Imagine if I popped one out and it turned out to be like some straight neurotypical finance bro. Oh my god, I would never be able to hold up my head in decent company like ever again.
Happy Pride! Oh. Mom, Dad, I told you, I have a girlfriend. I'm straight.
Sweetheart.
Carol! No son of mine will be straight.
Look at her in the eyes. She does not deserve this.
Look at Lady Gaga!
Today is the first day of Pride. I have made you this cake. Your grandmother is downstairs and she has bought you a new mesh crop top. You will wear it today with a smile on your face and a hard seltzer in your hand like the twink power bottom we raised you to be.
Movies and TV shows are full of straight people kissing and getting married and getting into relationships, including kids' movies. How many Disney movies feature a kiss at the end between a princess and her prince? No one is worried about that corrupting or influencing kids, but if it was a queer couple kissing, there would be an uproar. And let's not forget that for most of human history, families all slept together in one room where kids had to listen to their parents have sex at night because they needed more hands to help out on the farm, and the only way that was going to happen was by DIYing it. Was that considered grooming? No, because it was procreative sex and therefore not deviant. Last year in Ohio, Republicans introduced a bill to ban
adult cabaret performances
that feature
performers or entertainers who exhibit a gender identity that is different from the performers or entertainers' gender assigned at birth.
I.e. no drag queen brunches allowed in Ohio. Sorry guys, no fun for you. This was a response to a growing movement to protect kids from exposure to LGBTQ+ identities and people who are accused of being groomers. Conservative moral panic views drag not as a queer art form, which it is, but as a deviant and sexually charged display of those who were assigned male at birth, performing femininity and rejecting their masculinity. Because queer people so often subvert and dissect and play with gender, those who haven't taken the time to learn about what gender and sex actually are and are not, imagine all kinds of deviant things that queer people get up to, and panic ensues about us exposing their children to it. The conspiracy theory that links pedophilia to LGBT LGBTQ people is insidious and also very effective at manipulating uneducated parents who are understandably concerned about the health and safety of their children. But instead of directing their fear and outrage where it really belongs, towards capitalism and the systems that sustain it, and then doing actual real things to combat the actual real threats to their children's safety, like advocating for action against climate change or protesting authoritarian laws that limit bodily autonomy and freedom of expression, for example, it's far easier to hate on trans and queer people for being different because difference threatens the status quo, and status quo equals predictability, which therefore equals safety. Dr. Gillian Frank is a researcher who studies religion, sexuality, and gender at Princeton University, and he has the following to say about the LGBTQ plus groomer panic. A few things happen if we deploy this idea that our opponents are out to sexually harm children. For one thing, it associates one's opponents with the worst evil that humans are capable of committing, and by rendering them in this way as monsters, obviates the usual responsibility to treat them with basic respect. It also triggers a primal instinct in every parent to protect their child, one that can then be channeled against political opponents if the parents aren't discerning enough to realize they're being manipulated. Finally, and from a strategic standpoint most significantly, the tactic creates a psychological dynamic which forever deflects focus away from legitimate questions about social justice. Back to the idea of social dominance orientation, those who hold a hierarchical worldview are obviously interested in maintaining it. Hierarchical worldviews like capitalism and fascism and evangelical Christianity conceptualize power as being a zero-sum game where if it's shared with one group, it automatically takes away from another. If straight, white, cis men are forced to make way for diversity, equity, and inclusion, their entire social worldview falls apart. And since their worldview is the correct one, it therefore means that society is being overrun and corrupted by people who are inherently wrong and bad. The whole idea of queer and trans people being deviant is basically just repackaged misogyny. It comes from a fear of what will happen to the dominant social order and what it means for those who have power in it, i.e. men, if narrow definitions of sex and gender are questioned and openly rejected. If everyone stops doing what they're supposed to do to maintain the dominant social structure, then what will happen to society? Reducing queer people to our sexuality. There's nothing inherently sexual about drag or about being queer in general, but homophobes sexualize queer identities all the time. One of my biggest pet peeves about the "we support you and your lifestyle, but just don't shove it in our faces" mentality is that it reduces queer people to our sexualities, when in reality being queer is so much more than who you have sex with and how. Lots of queer people don't even have sex at all. Shout out to my sex-averse aces who are watching this. If you're not part of the community or don't have a lot of queer friends, then it's understandable why you'd think that way. A large part of being queer is about attraction, but also attraction isn't just about sex either. We can be attracted to people romantically, platonically, sensually, visually, artistically, aesthetically. Sexual attraction is just one kind of attraction, and for a lot of queer people, it's not even the most important one. I would actually argue that sexual attraction is way more important for straight people than it is for queer people, and straight people project their preoccupation with sex onto us. So much of straight culture is about hating your partner, especially men's hatred of women, and yet wanting to have sex with them anyway.
My body is very attracted to your body, but when you speak, my brain gets angry.
Patriarchy makes it really difficult for men to actually like women because in order to like someone, you need to identify with them on some level, and men are taught that it's not masculine to identify with women. Straight men may want to have sex with women, but everything in their culture teaches them from day one to not actually like us. To contrast, in queer culture, a big part of attraction is identification with the person or group of people that you're attracted to. Queer desire makes it possible to merge objectification with subjectification, or in other words, to have both a raunchy, lustful desire for someone that's also paired with a deep respect for and desire to support and protect their autonomy and personhood. When queer people are reduced to our sexualities and then labeled as deviant, it's A, dehumanizing and insulting, and B, it assumes that we experience desire and attraction in the same way that straight people do, just for the wrong types of people. Queer desire is not procreative. It serves no purpose other than joy and pleasure, and our Protestant work ethic, capitalist, patriarchal society doesn't like things that serve no practical or productive purpose. Queer sex doesn't achieve anything other than pleasure. It has nothing to show for itself other than a sense of joy and connection. It doesn't reduce women to our wombs and orifices or make martyrs of us by forcing us to center men's desires or give birth to men's children. It doesn't care about gender or genitalia. It's just a fun thing we can do sometimes amidst all the other fun things that there are to do in the world. Full stop. As I've explained in previous videos, patriarchy is a support system for capitalism, and capitalism is an outgrowth of the Protestant work ethic, which I don't have time to fully explore in this video, but is essentially a function of very extreme Christian evangelicalism. If you've seen the movie Witch, you've had a taste of what the Protestant work ethic is like and what it values and what it fears. In a nutshell, basically anything that doesn't involve hard work and bootstrapping and productivity is seen as lazy, self-serving, deviant, and morally suspect, including sex. Sound familiar? Perhaps because you've heard it before in the diatribes of your boomer uncle at Thanksgiving dinner. Our whole society is built on the Protestant work ethic, and it's where capitalism comes from. It's what allows it to exist, and it's deeply tied into strict gender roles, religious dogma, colonialism, and white supremacy. Maybe I'll do a video one of these days on the Protestant work ethic and the history of North American capitalism, but basically women's martyrdom is essential to its functioning. It's an extremely hierarchical worldview that places white men next to God and everyone else below and subservient to them, and it's very much still alive and well in our society. This worldview hates when women don't behave, when we don't toe the line, when we do things for ourselves and not for others. It hates when women are born in men's bodies. It hates when women love other women. It hates when women say no thank you to motherhood or have more than one partner. It hates when men act like women or wear women's clothes or otherwise do what straight men cannot and identify with femininity in some way, shape, or form. Sometimes homophobia is a case of those who doth protest too much and are afraid of queer people because they themselves are queer and not ready or able to recognize it. It's not an uncommon thing, but it's also not the case for everyone. By and large, I would argue that your garden variety, everyday homophobes and transphobes are just misinformed and don't understand what being queer really is all about. I, of course, have no data to back this up, and it's just an anecdotal observation, so please take that with a grain of salt. Broadly speaking, though, homophobia and transphobia as a concept comes from a hatred of women and from all things feminine. Esoterically speaking, the most feminine thing of all is unbridled freedom, and being queer is all about being free. That's going to do it, my loves. I hope you're all having an excellent Pride Month, and I'll do my best to get another video out before the end of the month, but no promises because my calendar is stacked until July. Be safe out there at all your events, and if you encounter any homophobes out there in the wild, just shake your head at them and feel bad for them because they are missing out. See you all in the next one. Toodaloo!
Thank you.